You and I, looking at this passage, we should see the humility of Jesus Christ, and he submits to mom and dad. This is a huge spiritual discipline that's neglected. It says Jesus went down with them because Jerusalem is up high, 3,000 feet. They're going to go down to Nazareth. And he continued in subjection, hupotasso, submitting to them, mom and dad. Now, that's a pretty amazing passage because while they are his mom and dad, let's face it, his capacities were greater than theirs. And so this whole question of submission is really important in our generation. Why? We live in a generation that's lawless, that's rebellious, that hates submission, that how dare you tell me anything, you know? And we see it in the workplace, we see it in all avenues of life in the deterioration of our society. I want you to see how Jesus submitted, how he submitted to the Father. Notice in his prayer in Matthew chapter 6, you could say it with me probably. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You know, we look around today, we don't see the will of God being done on the earth in many places and in many formats and in many settings. But that should be our earnest prayer. It was Jesus' prayer. Jesus stated ambition in his coming. Many times people will say, well, Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. That's true, Jesus said that. But why did he come to seek and save the lost? Well, John chapter 6 and verse 38 and Hebrews 10 tells us, he says that I've come to do the will of my Father who is in heaven. And so the submission of Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, to the Father, and obviously modeling that for us in prayer. And then Jesus' devotion. Jesus goes to the cross. Luke chapter 22, we're going to see that in the days ahead. And he goes there and he says, Father, let this cup pass from me. Let this cup of suffering, let the cross pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. Let me ask you a question. What was Jesus' will? Not to die on the cross. What was the will of the Father? For him to die on the cross. Submission is submitting to another individual. And so he submits to the will of the Father. And what does he do? He goes to the cross. Jesus practiced submission to God. But Jesus also, in this passage, submits to his parents. And that's the one that is so staggering, right? Because Jesus' capacity is greater than his parents. Hupotasso is used not only of Jesus submitting to his parents, but all things are going to submit to Jesus in the future. And hupotasso, that Greek word, is used this way as well in all of these passages describing how the Father will eventually honor Jesus because of his devotion to him and submit all things to Jesus. We're looking forward to this happening. When's it going to happen? When Jesus comes at the second coming and the millennial kingdom is set into play. We're looking forward to that day. Someone say amen to that. I mean, if you haven't watched the news lately, then, you can understand. All right, and then the demons, they hupotasso, they submit to Jesus and they submit to the apostles. Submission is part of the key elements of life here. We're going to see all believers and how hupotasso is used there. James chapter 4, verse 7, it says, submit to God and resist the devil. How do you resist the devil? You submit to God. It's right there in the sentence. What does submit mean? Hupotasso, to rank under, submit, to obey what he says, to surrender my will to the will of God. There's going to be times when you're going to want to do something different than God, but the question is, will you submit your will to God? And then there's submission to Jesus. And here in Ephesians chapter 5, it talks about the church, hupotasso, submitting to Jesus. This last month, I've been working with a church in another state, and there's just all this unrest and all of this brokenness in this church, and my heart just breaks. One of the elders at another church are helping me with this church, and yesterday he just texted me and said, this church is filled with all this division and all of this angst and all of this anger and all of this bitterness. And this is an abomination to Jesus. We never want to be in a situation where we're an abomination to Jesus. We should be submitting to Jesus as a church family. Spiritual leaders, we submit to them. Government, to one another. And throughout the course of life, there's going to be those that you and I are supposed to submit to. We're under them. And then there's going to be times when we're at peers with others. And there's going to be times when we're supposed to lead. And so wisdom is to know how to apply that. Submission is part of it for all of us. And then wives submitting to husbands, slaves to masters, young men to elders, gifts to believers, and so forth. My point for showing you that is this, is that submission is part of the spiritual disciplines of life. And Jesus at 12 years old is modeling it for us. He submitted to his mom and dad. You and I need to learn the discipline of submission.